My name is Amber, I'm 31 years old. And if you've ever smiled through a family dinner while your insides quietly hardened, this story is for you. I don't usually tell everything. Some things are private by habit, but there are nights and small mercies that carve a person into someone else. If you like slow-burning, true story-style confessions that end with a little quiet justice, hit subscribe. I post stories like this so you know you're not the only one who's had to learn how to protect herself. They'd asked for a car like it was a ceremony. Not "can you help," but "we're relying on you." The kind of line adults use when they want access, not assistance. My parents had been having money trouble for years, the kind that starts with bad luck and ends with borrowed excuses. My father liked to call it strategy. My mother called it family. My younger brother liked to call it an opportunity. I called it my hard work being treated like a revolving door. I'd made my own life in a cramped office above a bakery, late nights and lean months and more coffee than any doctor would recommend. It wasn't glamorous. It paid for rent, for the odd holiday, for the deep satisfaction of building something that belonged to me. When my parents' pleas turned into demands, A and B, we need reliability. A car to help Dad get to work and run errands. Nothing fancy, just steady. I agreed. Not out of blind softness, but because I thought maybe generosity could smooth out the cracks. Because despite the tired rules of our house, I wanted to help. So I bought them a car. I picked something sensible. A sedan that would not draw attention but would hold up against city potholes and the kind of grocery loads they hauled. I arranged the paperwork, signed the receipt with my name prominent, and watched my mother weep with gratitude when I drove it into their driveway. They called everyone a tiny coronation. The house smelled of jasmine and cake as relatives flowed in, and my chest swelled with a small, honest pride. It didn't take long for the gratitude to mutate. Within days, the car was family property, a phrase that meant anything could be asked of it and nothing could be returned. My brother started mentioning trips he needed to make, and my father talked about the new business plan that would finally get us out of this slump, which, as these plans often do, required a cushion, a fairly large cushion. That old pressure curdled into the same scene. They would look me in the eye and call my money the family pot. I tried to be reasonable. Asked for a plan, budgets, receipts. For someone who had once managed a balance sheet, I'd learned the language of accountability. Clear objectives, repaying terms, a schedule. I wanted structure. They wanted faith without math. The conversation that followed was so familiar I could have recited it. "We're family," my mother said, hands folded like an accusation and a benediction. "Trust us," my father insisted, as if trust absolved poor planning. In public, the script played out the way it always had. At a family dinner meant to celebrate this little help, all cousins and second cousins and a heavy pudding, my brother leaned in, bright as a fox, and said, loud enough for the room to hear, "Just hand it over, MB, you've got enough to spare." The room laughed as if the joke were on me. My mother clapped like the show was well staged. My father looked pleased, the way people do when they've arranged the chorus to a song they wrote years ago. Smiled. It's amazing how many people interpret a smile as assent. It's quieter than a fight and sometimes more powerful. I walked out of that room the way I had left many dinners before. Steady, not dramatic. But the smile was not surrender. It was focus. For the next week, their requests became cadence. I said no politely and presented my terms. Simple, unflashy conditions. A business plan, a timeline, a budget, external oversight. They said I didn't understand family, that I was cold. They used that old, tired weapon, the "you owe us" line. I've learned that "you owe us" is usually a tax on the generosity you once showed and the future you might have. One late night, after an argument about receipts and family obligations, I sat on my balcony and thought about ownership. It's a strange thing to realize that when you give, you sometimes give away your safety net too. The car was in their driveway, but the legal papers were in my file cabinet. Technically, the purchase was under my name. Practically, everyone acted as if my signature had been ceremonial. They had assumed the generosity, the access, and the right to treat my choices as public goods. On a pedantic whim and a practical impulse, I went through the owner documents again. There are always details you miss when you rush to do something generous. The manufacturer had a set of services, a concierge, a digital portal. Harmless, reassuring things like maintenance alerts and location features. These tools existed to help owners manage their vehicles safely. An extra key, a roadside assistance call, and a disabled for safety feature to aid in theft prevention. I registered the vehicle in my name properly and set up the account I was always meant to have had. I didn't do anything clandestine. Filled in forms. Kept receipts. I slept on the feeling that something small, legal, and reserved could give me options. Weeks passed. The pressure for money peaked at a family lunch when my father announced a new opportunity with a man he'd met at a cafe. A boutique logistics business, he said, a sure thing, with nothing but goodwill and ambition. The amount he asked for this time was not small. It was a number that sits in the place between impossible and reckless. It asked me to sacrifice my safety for a story. My mother looked at me with a face that had learned to wrap entitlement in tears. My brother smirked. The room turned my quiet into background noise. When I refused, again politely offering the conditions I trusted, the slap came in the gentlest way. Not a physical strike but a phrase, thrown into the room with precise cruelty. "You can afford it," my father said to the group, louder than he needed to be. "You're the one with that fancy life. Isn't that right? Not everything is about you. Be generous for once." Conversation softened into the polite cluck of approval. They'd made the refusal into spectacle, and people enjoy spectacles. My brother's face was a mirror for their smugness. My mother's smile had something sharp to it. I felt heat rise in my throat, not from shame but from the slow, cold recognition that I had been invited to play their role. Be the benevolent benefactor whose generosity keeps an engine of dependency running. I declined in private the way I always did. I took my purse, my dignity, and I left the house. I did not want a scene. I didn't want the jaw-clenched reproach or the family theatrics. I wanted, at last, a boundary that would be recognized. That night, after their calls and texted pleas spiraled into a dozen polite demands, I made a decision. I wrote an email to the financial accounts and services that I had set up alongside the purchase. The ones that legally recognized my ownership and the ones that provided the safety features. I did not ask anyone for permission to do what I had a right to do. The law around ownership is boring and bureaucratic and miraculous. It gives you the power to protect what is yours. I toggled options that were intended for security, not spite. I did not imagine scenes of men stranded on dark highways. I planned for a morning when the car would be unavailable until we all agreed on terms. A slow, safe pause that forced a conversation. I pressed send and went to sleep with the odd feeling of a storm that will be inconvenient but necessary. At 6:30 a.m. my phone started pinging. The sounds of the city were thin against the early sky. A dozen messages, voices rising in alarm. My mother's texts were small and frantic. "AMB, the car won't start," she wrote. My father's call came through sharp and immediate. "Why have you done this?" he demanded. "What right do you have?" My answer was even and direct. "You had access," I said. "But you didn't have the plan. Only safety holds while we agree on accountability." I told them I wasn't trying to crush them, only to insist on terms they'd refused to sign. They accused me of cruelty. I told them that asking for money without a plan was the cruelty I'd refused to normalize. They came to my door, each expression a study in horror and wounded dignity. My father's voice had that small, flinty edge of fury that men use when they realize their assumptions, in this case that generosity is infinite, are wrong. They pleaded. They bargained. My mother's words slipped from sorrow to sarcasm and back to pure pleading. I served them coffee and a ledger. I made them sit at my kitchen table and walk me through their true plan line by line. There were no bold charts, no projections, only hopes dressed up as figures. I asked questions that revealed holes. Who would be accountable? Where would revenue come from? Who would sign off on expenses? I asked them to commit to an independent accountant and a repayment schedule to me and a contribution from my brother. They sputtered and argued that would be humiliating, that family didn't need contracts. I reminded them that humility is different from naivete. They signed after 3 hours of awkward conversation that included the new vocabulary they hadn't often had to use. An accountant they selected reluctantly would oversee the flow. Expenses had to be reported monthly with receipts. Any future request would require written terms. I could see they didn't like it. I could also see the relief that came from structure. Giving with conditions is not unloving. For me it was honest. For them it felt like a loss of privilege. For a few weeks, the car remained a symbol of the new arrangement. Still theirs to use, but within a framework. The new rules settled like small linens across a table. They learned to send receipts. My brother took a course in bookkeeping because it was embarrassing not to know how to record transactions when everyone else could. My parents learned, imperfectly, to separate gratitude from entitlement. And then, like storms, patterns reasserted themselves. One evening when my father was late and the business had a client to impress, my brother went to start the car and it wouldn't catch. The engine turned and then died, giving the briefest, most helpless sound, silence in mechanics. He cursed, the sound raw with surprise. The mechanic they called found nothing physically wrong. The systems were as they should be. But in the owner's back end, the vehicle's status read, temporary safety lock engaged. A benign manufacturer-provided status that required authorization to turn off. They accused me of sabotage in front of the mechanic, in front of neighbors who had come to see what the commotion was about. I didn't answer the accusations with a lecture. I answered them with the only language they'd respected for years. Documentation. I brought from my wallet the printed receipts, the copies of emails, the signed agreements. I showed the line items. I showed the commitment to oversight. I explained in plain language that the safety feature had been engaged as a last resort, not to humiliate, but to protect my assets from being treated like a communal bank without accountability. They wanted drama, I wanted repair. So the next step wasn't public shaming. It was the kind of boring work most people avoid. Reconciliation through numbers. We sat in my kitchen again, ink-stained and slow. My brother signed up for bookkeeping classes and began to report properly. My father agreed to monthly audits for the business. My mother learned to ask for receipts rather than assuming a blank check. None of this came easy. There were nights when words were sharper than the lock on the car, nights of tears and anger and old accusations surfacing like rot. But the work continued. People sometimes ask if I felt guilty. I did not feel triumph, and what I felt most of the time was relief. There was grief for what it had taken for them to change, but not remorse for protecting my life. The immobilization of the vehicle, which I never described as some theatrical trick to the neighbors, and which I never implemented in a way that endangered anyone, created a moment to breathe and to demand accountability. That is not malice. That is survival. 6 months later, the house had a different rhythm. Not perfect but quieter. My mother called sometimes to say she'd balanced the budget. My father would ask for advice on a spreadsheet, and I would give it because being kind doesn't mean being bound. My brother, who once sneered about my fancy life, now asked how to inventory costs properly. Small changes, big meaning. Toward the end of the year, my father wrote me a note, an apology that was brief and steady, not theatrical. He said he understood that love and money are complicated and that he had used family to buy himself a comfort that was never meant to cost a child her autonomy. My mother cried in the doorway of my apartment once and said, "We were wrong. I'm sorry. It was messy, imperfect, and human." I deactivated the safety status legally and responsibly once the structures were in place. The accountant's oversight, the repayment plan, the clear reporting. I made sure everything could be undone cleanly, not as a favor but as a confirmation that boundaries had worked. I didn't keep the car as a trophy. I kept the dignity that came from not allowing my goodwill to be a weapon against me. If you're wondering whether I would do it again, the answer is complicated but clear. Yes, but only to the extent of protecting myself and insisting on respect. There are ways to demand accountability without malice. There are legal, safe tools that owners can use to protect their property and themselves. Tools that are meant to prevent theft and danger, not to harm. I used one of those tools within its proper scope. with the intention of forcing a conversation rather than creating a catastrophe. People will tell you revenge is petty or that generosity should be unconditional. They will stand in the auditorium of another person's life and clap because they like the show. But what I learned is this: generosity is not a free pass for people to forget boundaries. The most radical act is often the simplest: to say no until terms are met, and to insist that love does not mean economic servitude. I tell this as a small victory, not as a banner. The best part of the whole thing was not that the car didn't start one night. It was that, months later, I watched my brother sit at a small desk, working through invoices he understood. It was that my parents stopped assuming that my help would come without conversation. It was that the word please returned to our family. That's the change I wanted. Quiet, practical, real. So if you ever find your kindness twisted into a demand, remember you own your choice. Gifts can be offered with terms. Love can survive contracts. People will call you unkind for protecting yourself, but sometimes the kindest act is refusing to let yourself be taken. That's my story. The night I bought a car for the people who raised me, and the night I used the quiet authority of ownership to set a boundary that finally meant something. It's not a tale of spectacle. It's a story about the ways we learn to keep our dignity when the people we love keep mistaking our generosity for a bank account. If you like this, please subscribe. I share stories like this because someone had to tell them out loud, and because sometimes the softest actions make the loudest changes. The car stopped moving on a quiet stretch of road, just outside the city. I watched from my phone as the tracker flashed red, motionless. I knew exactly where my brother Eric would be at that time, probably blasting music, thinking the universe revolved around him. My phone buzzed moments later. "Amber, the car just died on the road." Eric's panicked voice came through. "Oh really?" I replied softly. "Did you check the fuel?" "It's not that. The engine just cut off. And now it won't start." I bit my tongue to keep from smiling. Must be karma. What's that supposed to mean? "Nothing," I said, keeping my voice flat. "Call Dad. Maybe he knows something about it." I hung up before he could respond. It wasn't about the car. Never was. It was about respect, something I had been denied all my life. I had worked 3 jobs after college, built a business from nothing, paid off debts they didn't even know existed. And still in their eyes I was the stubborn daughter, the one who didn't obey. That car was my way of giving back, a small piece of gratitude to the parents I thought might finally see me. Instead, they handed it to Eric like it was his birthright. No hesitation. No discussion. When I confronted them, Mom said, "He's your brother, Amber. You'll have more money later." Dad added, "You're single, you don't even need a car." I remember standing there, holding the keys in my hand, my chest tightening. I said nothing, not because I agreed, but because words would have been wasted on people who only listened when it hurt them to stay deaf. Now, as I watched them panic through my phone, part of me wanted to feel guilt. I didn't. By evening, the family group chat was blowing up. Dad: "Amber, what did you do to the car?" Mom: "Your brother is stranded." Eric: "You're sick. Fix it now." I put the phone down and continued eating dinner. The silence of my apartment felt like the warmest sound I'd heard in months. Later that night, Dad called again. His tone wasn't angry, just pleading. "Amber, don't do this. He's your brother." He was scared. "Then maybe he'll learn not to take what isn't his," I replied. "Are you punishing your parents too?" he asked quietly. "No," I said, looking out the window. "I'm reminding them who actually bought that car." He hung up without another word. The next morning I woke to a knock at my door. Through the peephole I saw my mother, makeup smudged, eyes tired. My heart raced, but I opened it anyway. "Amber," she started, "this has gone too far." "Has it?" I asked, stepping aside. "Come in." She sat on the couch, her voice trembling. "You embarrassed the family. Everyone knows about the car. Your brother told people you sabotaged him." "I didn't sabotage him," I corrected softly. "I just took back what's mine." She looked at me with disbelief, as if she couldn't recognize the woman in front of her. What happened to you? She asked. I grew up, I said. You just weren't paying attention. She stayed silent for a long moment, then sighed. Your father is angry. But deep down he knows he was wrong. Can't you just let this go? I shook my head. No, Mum. You've all taken enough from me. My peace isn't negotiable anymore. There it was. A sentence that silenced a lifetime of insults. That night I reactivated the tracker. The car was still where it had stopped. Eric must have left it sulking. But this time I didn't disable it. I made another decision. One that would shift everything again. The next morning I listed the car for sale. Under my name. With all the documents. 'Cause it was mine. By noon I had a buyer. Cash in hand. When Dad called again, his voice was low and cold. You sold the car. Yes, I replied calmly. It was my car, Dad. You humiliated this family, he shouted. No, I said, almost whispering. You did that when you gave away something that wasn't yours. He hung up. 2 hours later, Mom texted me a photo. It was my father sitting outside the house staring into space. No words, no anger, just shock. For a moment, guilt flickered again. But then I remembered. He had smiled when I stood there empty-handed, watching my gift being handed to someone else. Now for the first time I smiled back. For the first time in years my phone stayed silent for 2 whole days. No calls. No guilt texts. No family emergencies. Just peace, the kind I had forgotten existed. But I knew it wouldn't last. On the 3rd morning a message came through from Mom. Mom, your father isn't eating. Eric hasn't spoken since you sold the car. Please, can we talk? I stared at the screen for a long time, torn between anger and exhaustion. It wasn't that I wanted them to suffer. I just wanted them to finally see me. To understand that love without respect isn't love at all. Still I agreed to meet. But this time not at the family house. That place carried too many ghosts, too much noise. I chose a quiet cafe downtown, neutral ground. When I arrived, they were already there. Dad in his usual pressed shirt, Mom clutching her purse like it might shield her from the tension. They looked smaller somehow, fragile, like people whose power had finally met a wall. Amber, Dad began, his voice low but still sharp. You went too far. I sat down slowly, keeping my tone calm. No, Dad. I just stopped being quiet. He leaned back, shaking his head. You humiliated this family over a car. That car, I said, meeting his eyes, was a symbol. You didn't take the car. You took my effort, my gratitude, my trust. And when you gave it to Eric, you told me none of that mattered. Mom reached for my hand. We were wrong, she said softly. But you have to understand, Eric's been struggling. He's not as strong as you. I smiled bitterly. You made sure he didn't have to be. Silence fell. The clinking of cups and soft cafe chatter felt miles away. Dad exhaled, his pride crumbling just a little. We raised you both the best we could. No, I said gently. You raised a son you could protect and a daughter you could use. For a moment, neither of them said a word. Then Dad's face softened, just slightly, and he looked down. Maybe you're right, he admitted. That was the first time in my life I'd heard my father say those words. I didn't push further. I just nodded, stood up and said, I'm not angry anymore. I'm just done being treated like less. As I turned to leave, Mom whispered, Amber, wait. Pause. She looked up at me, her eyes wet. We lost your trust. But I want to earn it back. Just don't shut us out completely. I nodded once. That depends on whether you start seeing me for who I am, not who you want me to be. That night I drove home in a quiet rental car. Ironic, I thought, since I no longer had the one I bought myself. But the difference was, this car didn't carry betrayal in its back seat. It was just mine, simple, silent, peaceful. When I parked outside my apartment, I checked my messages again. One from Eric. Eric. You didn't have to do that. I'm sorry for what I said. I get it now. I stared at the message, unsure how to feel. Anger. Relief. It was strange. For years I had wanted him to understand what it felt like to be invisible. And now that he did, I didn't feel joy. Just release. Me. I'm not your enemy, Eric. I just stopped being your doormat. He didn't reply. And that was okay. Some silences heal more than words ever could. Weeks passed. Life settled. My business grew. I finally started sleeping without feeling like I owed someone an apology for existing. Then, one afternoon, something unexpected happened. Mom called again, but this time her voice sounded lighter. Amber, your dad and I want to see you. We have something for you. I hesitated. Is this another family meeting? She chuckled softly. No drama this time. Just come home. When I arrived, the car I had sold was sitting in the driveway. But it wasn't the same car. 'Twas new. In-ear. The exact same model, same color. Except this time the license plate read. For Amber. Dad came outside holding the keys. It's yours, he said quietly. Bought it ourselves. No one else's name on it. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Why are you doing this? He asked. He looked at me, really looked, for the first time in years. Because respect shouldn't come as an apology. It should have been there all along. Mom nodded, eyes glistening. We're proud of you, sweetheart. Truly. For once, I believed her. That night, driving back home, I realized something important. Revenge had never been about hurting them. It had been about reclaiming me. The quiet, invisible daughter who gave everything and asked for nothing. Until one day, she stopped asking. Now, every time I start that car, I don't think about betrayal anymore. I think about boundaries. And how peace, once you earn it, sounds a lot like the hum of an engine you own completely. Strange how life softens with time. You think the anger will last forever, that the sting of betrayal will always live under your skin, but it doesn't. Eventually it fades, replaced by something quieter, something deeper. It's been 8 months since that day in the driveway. 8 months since my father handed me those new car keys and told me, with an honesty I never thought I'd hear, we're proud of you. Sometimes I still replay everything in my head. The arguments, the silence, the long years of feeling unseen. It's not to dwell on the pain anymore, but to remind myself of how far I've come. Because once, I would have done anything for their approval. Now I live for my own peace. The family dynamics didn't magically transform overnight. My parents didn't become perfect. They still slip into their old habits sometimes. Mom still fusses about Eric's future like the world owes him comfort, and Dad still tries to advise me on my business as if I hadn't built it alone. But I learned the most powerful word I'd ever said in my life. No. No to guilt. No to manipulation. No to being the responsible one at the cost of myself. And that word, no, has protected my peace more than any revenge ever could. Few weeks ago, Eric called again. He sounded nervous, uncertain, the way he used to when we were kids and he'd broken something. Amber, he said, I've been thinking a lot about what happened. You were right. I took advantage. I didn't realize it then, but you were always the one keeping this family running. I'm sorry. I didn't say anything for a moment. His voice cracked, and for the first time I heard sincerity. Not shame, not defensiveness, but genuine remorse. Eric, I said finally, you don't owe me an apology. You just owe yourself a better version of who you've been. That's enough. He was quiet. Then he said, you sound like Mom these days. I smiled faintly. Maybe I just sound like someone who finally learned to let go. That night I went for a drive. Just me, the road, and the soft glow of the dashboard. The world outside was calm. Streetlights blurring past like quiet memories. I turned on the music, the kind that makes your chest ache in the best way, and rolled the windows down. There's something healing about wind on your face when you've spent years feeling trapped by expectations. At a red light, I glanced at the reflection in the window. Not the dutiful daughter. Not the people pleaser. Not the woman who silently gave everything while pretending she didn't mind. Just me, Amber. 31. Independent. Oh. I thought about the car I once bought to make my parents proud. The one they gave away like it meant nothing. And then I thought about this car, the one they returned to me not as a gift, but as a sign that they finally saw my worth. I realized something then. It was never really about the car. It was about value, about who gets to define it. For the longest time I believed my worth came from what I gave. But that night, as I drove through the quiet city, I understood. My worth comes from what I refuse to give away anymore. When I got home, there was a small box waiting on my doorstep. Inside was a note from Mom. Her handwriting, neat and careful, read, "We found your old graduation photo. You look so proud. We just wanted to say, we're proud too. Always have been. Love, Mom and Dad." I sat there on my couch for a long time, holding that note. It wasn't about forgiveness or payback anymore. It was about peace, the kind that doesn't shout, doesn't demand, doesn't seek approval. Peace that simply is. I smiled, folded the note, and placed it inside the glove compartment of my car. Because sometimes peace doesn't look like reconciliation. Sometimes it looks like driving alone at night, windows down, heart light, knowing that for once you don't owe anyone a single explanation. And that is freedom.